Hey guys, the other day I was scrolling through Twitter and I saw a video that caught my eye by a user called Nine Finger Games, and I thought the idea looked interesting. It was a yin-yang style Pong simulation where on one side you have a black ball with a white background and the other side you have a white ball with a black background, and they just kind of bounce around and expand their own area. So I thought this would be a fun project to do myself, and so I started by making a Unity project. The first things I needed were some assets to use, so I opened GIMP, a free imaging editing program like Photoshop, and I made a white square that I could use for both the white background and the black background, and later on I also made a white ball sprite, which I used for the white ball and the black ball during the simulation as well. After I made myself some assets, I went ahead and added the white square to Unity and started creating prefabs for the background tiles. My idea for how this would work is that I would just have a bunch of background tile squares that have their own collision, and that the different balls would be on their own collision layer. So the black ball wouldn't interact with white squares and vice versa. And to start out, I kind of just made it really simple. I made a game object with a sprite, a box collider, and a custom box controller script. Next up, now that I have my background tile prefabs, I made a game object and a custom script to create the background area. And I just used two nested for loops with references to the prefabs, and based on a certain exposition, I switched from spawning a white background to a black background, and it's just a very simple script setup like that. Now that I had my background, I decided it was time to get to work on the balls. So for the ball sprite, I went back into GIMP like I said before and just created a circle from there. And then once the sprite was imported, I decided to use it to make the ball game objects, and they have rigid bodies and circle colliders and a custom script that randomizes a direction at the start. And that's really all it does right now, but later on I do use it for momentum conservation. I started with the white ball, but I actually got the sides flipped and the colors flipped. So I actually had the white ball on the white side and the black ball on the black side, and I just used the opposite color for the outline. I fixed this later on, but that's how I started it out. I also remember running into an issue with the physics layer interaction detection stuff, and I think the way I fixed that is by finding an exclude drop down in the box collider options for the background objects, the background prefabs for the background tiles, the black and white tiles. You can exclude certain layers on those colliders, and that is how I got around that issue and actually got the balls to bounce around. I also needed to create a physics material with a bounce value of 1, and I also set the friction to 0, so that way the balls wouldn't lose any momentum. But for that issue, I will actually have to come back later and do it through script anyway, because when you add more than one ball on each side, when they collide, something weird still happens with the momentum sometimes, so I just decided to handle it myself later on. It was also around this time that I realized my balls could bounce off of the opposite tile, but they would also just kind of go off the screen because there was nothing else for them to bounce off of on the opposite side of the area that they were bouncing in. So I had to create a border tile, and just for when I was programming it in, I colored it red and tested the collisions that way. The next thing to implement was when the balls collide with the opposite color square, that they take over that square and expand their own area. So essentially it's just swapping a tile from one color to the other. And to do that, initially I set it up with just on trigger 2D enter events, where if you enter in the triggered area for the tile from like a ball, if a ball bounces on that tile, then it would invoke a function to swap the tile from black to white by destroying the previous tile and instantiating the opposite color. And this method is very inefficient and does not scale well, so I do try and clean that up later on. But for now, this is what I did. And I also had to add a delay before swapping the square, otherwise the ball would just kind of drill through the opposing wall rather than bounce off, because I was destroying the tile it was colliding with right away before it had a chance to bounce off of it. And attempting to optimize and fix this later on does lead to some interesting looking issues. Now that everything was essentially working, I wanted to stress test it by adding more balls to collide in the area to see how the performance was. And then once I was able to do that, I corrected the colors of the balls, so now the black is on the white tiles and vice versa. And the next thing I wanted to do was add a sort of board multiplier, so I could multiply like the number of tiles for like the rows and the columns and just make the area bigger. And also by doing that, I wanted to scale the camera orthographic size so that everything would fit within the camera's view. And at this point, everything was looking okay, so I made a real build and added a multiplier to make the tiles really fine and added multiple balls, because I thought everything was going to be fine performance-wise, and starting out it looked okay. But then as the simulation went on, I noticed some stuttering, and then ultimately everything just froze. So now to resolve those performance issues, I had the idea to make the tiles one object that would just have child objects for the black and white tiles, and it would just enable and disable depending on what state it was in, rather than deleting itself and instantiating the opposite tile, because that is very inefficient and gives the garbage collector a lot of work to do, and over time I guess that adds up and costs a lot of performance. However, while doing this change, I found a lot of weird issues. For example, one weird issue I found was the balls weren't actually bouncing off of the different colored tiles, but instead were going right through them and creating like their own trail patterns. And I just kind of let that run for a little bit before I stopped it, because it looked kind of cool, but it really wasn't what I was going for. Once I got it working again, I noticed another small issue that has been happening throughout the rest of the project so far, and that is collision detection issues between the tiles and the ball, where intermittently the ball wouldn't actually trigger the tile to switch its color. So to resolve this, I tried reducing the speed of the balls, thinking that would give them more time to register contact. I also tried adding rigid bodies and all sorts of things to the different tiles to see if that would maybe help, and reducing the speed seemed to help the most. However, it did not fully resolve the issue the way I liked it, so eventually I had to implement my own solution. So to resolve the collision detection issues my own way, I went back into my script where the collisions were detected with the onTrigger method, and I commented that out, and instead I made a loop and update where I would get an array for all of the different balls separated by color that were in the simulation, and each frame I would just calculate the distance from the ball to the specific tile. And this isn't very efficient either, but it does guarantee that the collisions are accurate within a certain distance. So this is what I ended up going with, especially if you keep the number of balls in the simulation low, then this really isn't an issue. You could also probably improve this by introducing multi-threading for detecting the different ball positions and calculations. I tried to do that afterwards, but it actually performed worse. So I might have something to learn there. And if I do, I might post an update. The final change I made to this project was normalizing the speed for the balls during every update frame, just because I don't like how the momentum was being transferred when I had multiple balls in the simulation. And also this way I could theoretically control the speed of the balls after the simulation has started by just upping their speed value, and then they would actually just go faster rather than just setting an impulse force at the beginning of the simulation and then having no control over the speed later on. Anyway, if you made it this far into the video, thank you very much for watching. And if you liked the video, leave a like. Feel free to subscribe. 90% of you guys aren't subscribed, and doing so would really help me out. And as a little treat, here is a 50 times sped up simulation of the balls fighting for their own territories. So leave a comment down below for any projects you think would be fun in the future. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.